Welcome to Know Before You Go for the 32nd Sunday in Ordinary Time. I'm Father Don Goergen. Let me begin by just asking a question. Do you believe yourself that there is more to life than this life alone? In other words, that there is life beyond this life. Not to the detriment of our desire to find as much happiness in this life as we can, but that there is more life even beyond death. Do you believe that? In our texts today, we are challenged to think about the resurrection from the dead. Our first reading is from one of the book of Maccabees. You may be less familiar with the story of the Maccabees, except it was a story of a mother and 7 sons, and how in the mid-2nd century before Christ, they gave their lives as martyrs rather than conform to the pagan practices that came from the Roman occupation of Jerusalem. The mother even encouraged her sons not to give in, not to give up their faith, but to choose death if necessary in order to remain faithful to their traditions. In fact, one of the sons says, "We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." Now, this story of their martyrdom is important because it is at this time that some of the Jewish people began to believe in resurrection from the dead. Prior to that, the Jewish people had no sense for the individual that we would be raised from the dead, that there would be a future for the Israelites, for the nation, but not for the individual. But struggling with the martyrdom of these 7 brothers and their mother, they came to the awareness that if God is just, there has to be something more. And that is the question. Is God just? And if so, there has to be more than this life alone. So it made the Jewish people, some of them, begin to think, and they began therefore to come to an appreciation of the resurrection, at least of the righteous ones, of the prophets, of the martyrs, of those that had served God well. And so if we come to our gospel text, it is a story about resurrection, and it begins with the sense that some Sadducees, those that deny resurrection of the dead, in other words, in the time of Jesus, there were different groups, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and others. The Pharisees, in fact, were ones who believed in the resurrection. The Sadducees did not. And in our gospel text from Luke, some of the Sadducees who deny it are attempting to trick Jesus in some ways, showing how illogical the notion of resurrection would be, because if a woman had several husbands in this life, who would be her husband in the life to come? And therefore, that doesn't make sense, so there must be no resurrection from the dead. And Jesus, of course, corrects that, saying that God is a God of life, a God of the living, and therefore at least the patriarchs of old, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would have life. But why do I believe in resurrection from the dead? To a great degree, it's because we place our hope in justice, that if there is nothing beyond this life alone, then indeed the world in which we find ourselves is incredibly unjust. When we think of those whose lives have been lived in misery, short-lived, starvation, disease. In other words, we may be fortunate to have enjoyed this life, but the far majority of humanity doesn't always have that luxury. And therefore, we place our hope in the fact that there is more to life so that those who have not found their satisfaction and fulfillment here and now will in a life to come. And therefore, if God is just, if we believe in God, then we do believe that God can bring back the dead and give them life. And thus, unlike the Sadducees, the Christian community began to believe in resurrection, especially because the earliest followers experienced Jesus as raised from the dead. And as St. Paul would say, if Jesus has not been raised, then our faith is in vain. And if Jesus has been raised, then we too will be raised from the dead. So, as we approach the end of this period of time in which we are still in ordinary time, but before Advent, we are asked to stop and look at our lives and say, in some ways, why I believe myself, not just accept it, but why I do deeply, firmly believe in it. And I can ask myself the question, what is it that I live for? And what am I willing to die for? For the Maccabean martyrs, they were willing to give their lives to be faithful to their traditions. Likewise, we should be willing to die for the sake of justice, for the sake of our faith, because we believe there is more to life. In other words, to put it simply, death is not the bottom line about life. Death is simply a way of talking about a transition from this life to another kind of life about which we can't say much. It's hard to imagine, but in which we place our trust. That yes, we do desire to find fulfillment and happiness and joy and peace in this life. But even if we do, we're aware there is more to life. There is the fullness of life. There's what God has in store for those who love God. There are those, in a way, who long, yearn for what God has created us ultimately for. So let us not be slack about our conviction about future life. It doesn't deter us from striving to find joy for everyone here and now and peace on earth, but at the same time to keep our eyes on what God has in store for us that is beyond anything we can imagine, and that someday justice will prevail. God bless you.